Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this show. This show, whose title is called A Brief History of the Jewish People in France. Today's guest is Michael Westwood, who currently resides in Marseille. And Michael Westwood is a tour guide and a historian, and he is currently married to Sandra, and has been married to Sandra since February 2014, and he is a buff on history, and today we will be dealing with and talking and discussing the Jewish people in France, and particularly the history of the Jewish people. So Michael, I'm glad that we have you as a guest, and that you are talking about the Jewish people. Can you give us a bit of the credentials that you have that you can share that says that you know a bit about this subject and are experienced about this subject?
Thanks, David. It's always a pleasure to talk to you as well. As far as my credentials go, I read history at the London School of Economics in the early 2000s, and I studied French as well as history. I moved to France quite recently, well, about 7 years ago, in 2014. I've been residing in Marseille ever since. I suppose you could say, partially integrated to the Jewish community here in Marseille, because my wife is of Tunisian Sephardic descent. And I also, before starting to work in the maritime industry in shipping, I worked a few contracts in the Haute School in Marseille. I'm sure that some of the viewers of Cool TV might themselves be Haute educated, especially if they've spent time in Israel.
That's good. Now, with regards to the Jewish communities, let's start with the basics. Okay, what archaeological evidence has been unearthed in France and in Gaul, in France, with regards to the Jewish communities and the Jewish people?
Well, the Romans invaded Gaul under Julius Caesar. He actually led a legion himself during the invasion of Marseille, the siege of Marseille. As far as archaeological evidence is concerned, one of these was found not far from Avignon in the south of France, an oil lamp with a depiction of a menorah on it, which has led archaeologists to believe that the Jewish community in France was present from 70 AD. There are many foundation myths, as there are with every civilization and community. The most popularized one would be the three ships myth. Supposedly there was a ship which landed at Bordeaux, a ship which landed at Lyon, so it would have traveled inland via the Rhone, and a ship which landed at Arles with Jewish passengers aboard not long after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. I can't really say that there's much historical evidence for the latter, that is the ship myth, but as far as the oil lamp's concerned, it certainly dates from before the 4th century, and if the depiction on it is not just a memory, a souvenir, then it's entirely possible that it dated from 70 AD, immediately after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem.
Okay, now, as a result of this, obviously, the next question that needs to be asked and explored is, of course, the establishment of Jewish communities in the south of France, and in what way has that been manifested?
Well, the south of France was a veritable melting pot for lots of cultures. The entire Mediterranean basin, and this can be attested by the trade records, had a sizable Jewish community. From the New Testament texts, we know that there was a sizable Jewish community in Rome in the 1st century. As far as Jewish communities in France were concerned, there was a sizable community in Montpellier and again in Marseille. In fact, in Montpellier now there's an institute, an educational institute, which is called the Maimonides Institute, named after the Jewish philosopher and sage Maimonides. The practices of the Kabbalah were both conceptualized and hammered out in the south of France, in and around Montpellier. And as far as Marseille is concerned, 10% of the population of the ancient citadel, and I'm talking about from the 1st century until the 10th, up until the 16th century in 1501, 10% of the population of Marseille was Jewish.
Wow. Now, can you please explain to the audience what the intercultural exchange up until the 14th century is all about, and how that drove the Jewish communities to have their identity in France?
Yeah, sure. all of the French ports were populated by Jews. There were Jews living in all of the French ports, especially in the Mediterranean ports. And as you know, Marseille is a port city. It has been for 2,600 years, when the Greeks set up a trading counter here. The Jewish people who lived in Marseille had many professions. They weren't restricted up until the 13th century either. So we're not into the enforced money lending that took place from the 13th century onwards in Europe. So it's essentially Jewish people occupied all professions in Marseille, and then there was an enormous amount of participation in civic occasions.
Well, then we led to, of course, obviously the winds of change leading up to the persecution, and presumably this persecution leads on to another subject which we'll get into.
Mm-hmm.
So at what time did this winds of change start to show itself, and at what stage in history did the persecution take place?
I think variously. There were several occasions whereby persecution could have happened, and then several occasions when French rulers, as did other rulers in Europe, jumped on the occasion to enact anti-Semitic laws. At this stage, I'd use the word anti-Jewish laws rather than anti-Semitic laws, because at this point there was nothing racial in its nature. That came later. But in 1215 you had the first you had the Lateran Treaty, which in a shorthand way you could refer to it as the Treaty of the Inquisition. This led to the weaponizing of the Inquisitions towards the Cathars, principally in the south of France, leading to what was known as the Cathar tragedy. 1 million Cathars were killed during the Cathar Inquisitions. Well, we say Cathars, but you can also say Albigensians, Christians, Bible-believing Christians who came from the city of Albi and thereabouts. So there was the Lateran Treaty of 1215, which, as well as laying out the roadmap for the Inquisitions in Europe, not just in France but in Spain and elsewhere, also had a clause involving the wearing of a yellow circle on your garments if you were Jewish. So this was the first demarcation, if you like, the first public singling out of Jewish people. Now, some kings, some rulers actually executed this law to the letter and forced their Jewish subjects to wear a yellow circle on their garments. Most kings didn't. This didn't happen in a lot of kingdoms in Europe. But in 1269, King Louis, Saint Louis, as he was known, King Louis the Ninth, decided to enforce this law to force Jewish people to wear a yellow circle on their garments. So for me, this was the start of the singling out of the Jews, the start of a designation of other, as it were, whereas before there was a certain integration and a lot of participation in civic life.
Now we lead to another thing that happened, of course, and that is the Banishment Act of 1306. Now, not much is known about this in Britain, and I'm pretty certain that a lot of people in other parts of Europe will not know about the Banishment Act. Can you please lay out what the Banishment Act is and how it was implemented, and indeed the effect that it had on the Jewish community in France?
Yeah, certainly. I think when you talk about Philip le Bel or Philip the Fair, most people will associate the name with the banishment of the Templars in 1307, the following year. However, the same king also banished the Jews from France. The banishment of the Jews involved the banishment and the wholesale looting of 100,000 Jews from France. They were expelled from the Kingdom of France, as it was then, and they ended up in Spain, in Portugal, and elsewhere. They also ended up in Provence, which until 1484 was a separate country, a separate kingdom.
Now, I take it that this led to the Comtat Venaissan, or the Papal Jews, and the establishment of the carrières or ghettos in Provence. Now, I take it that that was the knock-on effect of the Banishment Act.
I can't really say that there was cause and effect as far as the banishment was concerned. The carrières, which comes from a word in Provençal, which was the language spoken in the south of France in those days, were established already at the end of the 13th century. In 1274, I believe, the Jewish community established itself in Avignon. The popes came to live in Avignon, established their palace there, by way of in fact, what they did was to annex an existing monastery, and they came and resided there from in 1315. The wholesale attribution of living quarters and ghettoization came a lot later. Would you like me to go into some detail about the carrière? I can, if you like.
Yeah, well, that would be interesting. Yeah, just fill us in with some of the salient points of the carrière.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the population, the population of the carrière was composed of people who've been living in France for hundreds of years. They were French Jews. They were native, as it were. There was a small amount of people who'd come over from France and Portugal and Catalonia, but for the most part, the people living in the carrière were French Jews. Now, numbers fluctuated from 2,000 to over 10,000. These people living in 4 cities principally. So they were living in Avignon, Cavaillon, Île-sur-la-Sorgue, and Carpentras. These cities were known as the Arba Kahilot, so the four holy communities. The specificity of these cities, their unique nature was that they were situated in what was known as the Comtat Venaissan. Okay, Comtat means county. It's a word in Provençal, and it was an area which was the property of the papacy. It was previously sold to the papacy, and this was, as I said, acted in 1315 when the papacy took control of Avignon, took possession of Avignon. So in each of these cities, there was a designated street. Carrière means street, where the Jews of that town would live. In the beginning, in the 14th century, you couldn't really call it ghettoization. The people who lived there had the freedom to buy property, to live in the carrière, but also to carry out their professions and trade with non-Jews. And the only restriction, although it was a fairly heavy restriction and wasn't altogether pleasant, was that there was a chain, a simple chain, which was posed on the entrance on the 2 entrances of the carrière at the end of the day, at sundown. The real segregation and ghettoization started in 1504. This was when a door was placed at the entry of the carrière. Now, why did they do this? Why did they ghettoize the Jews in these cities, in these towns? What happened essentially was roaming vine workers would come to Provence from Italy and Spain, and would whip up anti-Jewish fervour in Cavaillon, in Carpentras, and in Avignon, and there would be attacks upon the people living in the carrière. So it was decided that doors would be put on the carrière to protect the inhabitants. For me, personally, I'm a little bit skeptical about that. I think the 16th century was the beginning of a new wave of anti-Jewish fervour, and I think talking about the sort of knock-on effect and protection of the community was a bit of an excuse for acting in a punitive way against these communities.
Now, as we've dealt with this, can you then take us through how this transition from that period of time to the influx of Portuguese and Spanish Sephardim following the Inquisition?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there was a big influx of Sephardic Jews into France following the Inquisitions, which were unleashed in Spain in 1492. I suppose you could say, contrary to the expulsion of the Jews in France, the Inquisition in Spain was more of a wholesale genocide. The Jews fled to first of all to Portugal, and then they were inquisited in Portugal as well. And then when they came to France, they ended up principally in Bordeaux. Some ended up in Marseille, and then were immediately expedited to North Africa. So you had at this point immense Jewish Sephardic communities in North Africa. the Sephardic Jews who ended up in Bordeaux were given a special status. As you may or may not know, in Spain there were Jewish converts. When I say Jewish converts, for the most part, they weren't really converted. These were just forced baptisms. And when I say baptisms, I don't mean full immersion in water. I mean sprinkling water on people's heads and forcing them to take a vow. These people were known as the Moranes, or pork eaters. And in France, they were known as néophytes. Okay, so a small population moved to Bordeaux of néophytes, and they became known as the Portuguese Jews. Whether they were from Spain or Portugal didn't really matter to the authorities in those days. They were simply labelled as the Portuguese Jews. Now, these people were given a royal letter of dispensation in order to reside in Bordeaux, and this was the case up until the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the subsequent revolution in 1789.
Now, this obviously is it's quite an in-depth subject, but to deal with another aspect of this was the special statutes according to the individuals and communities from the 15th to the 18th century. Please give us a description of that so that we can anchor our understanding into this period of time for Jewish people in France.
Okay, yeah. Well, as I just said, the certain Jews, the Jews in Bordeaux, were given the royal letter of dispensation. Similar measures were in place in Alsace. In Provence, there were certain exemptions to the draconian laws which were put in place in the carrières as well. So from the 17th century onwards, Jews could in fact move from place to place. They couldn't possess property, but in villages which were of proximity to the assigned papal Jewish villages, apartments were put aside which could be rented out by Jews. And they could also stay outside after dark as well.
And what exactly was the reform under the ancien regime, and how was that implemented?
Okay, there were real winds of change in the 18th century, and from the 1760s onwards, there were a lot of decrees and acts which were strangely enough created by abbots and members of the clergy. There was an atmosphere of change. It was of course, the beginnings of what we call La Lumière, and that phase in philosophy, political philosophy. So there were decrees which were put in place to give Jewish people the same rights as Gentiles. None of these were actually enacted as such until after the French Revolution.
Well, that leads us to the reforms after the French Revolution, and how was that implemented in France?
Okay, there were the consistories, which were created, the sort of state-sanctioned synagogues. Whenever there was a sizable Jewish community in a town or in a part of the city, in a neighborhood, they would create what was called a consistory. At the time of the consistories, anybody who wanted to play a part legally in the Jewish community in civil matters, rabbis and others as well, any public figures, in fact, and even just anybody who wanted to carry out a profession in France, had to answer what were called the 12 questions. The 12 questions involve questions on bigamy, such as in the Republic of France, is it permitted for a man to marry more than one woman? Now, to these questions, there were fairly staple replies, such as in the Republic of France, unlike in other countries, it is not permitted to marry more than one woman, etc. So these 12 questions were asked, the answers were given, and the call was given for people to carry out whichever profession they wanted to.
And what progress was made during the 19th century in France that led to the Jewish community and its identity?
Well, enormous progress was made to the extent that you had legislators such as Crémieux, whose ancestors actually came from the carrières in the south of France, becoming part of the government and making laws. Crémieux was the politician which drew up the law which gave Jews French citizenship in Algeria. This was a big leap forward, because hitherto Jewish people didn't have any status in Algeria. They didn't have a legal status. You've got to look at this with keeping in mind, bearing in mind that there were Jewish communities in Algeria and Tunisia as far back as the Babylonian exile. So these were historic Jewish communities, and as I said, in 1870 they were accorded the right to French citizenship.
Okay, now we can then deal with and take us through to the reactionary politics and the Dreyfus Affair. Now, I know that the Dreyfus Affair was a major deal in France, and one of the reporters that reported the Dreyfus Affair was Theodor Herzl, who was instrumental in the Zionist movement for the dream to give birth to the rebirth of the nation state of Israel. Can you please describe the reactionary period of time and politics and the Dreyfus Affair, and more or less in as succinct detail as is possible, describe exactly what happened there?
Yeah, sure. Dreyfus was an officer, a high-ranking officer, a highly decorated and high-ranking officer in the French army, who was accused of espionage, falsely accused of espionage, and then he was extradited to Devil's Island in French Guiana, where he spent 4 years, from 1894 to 1898, until his name was cleared. And then the affair carried on until his name was cleared in 1906. What led to this, you might ask? There was an enormous amount of reactionary journalism which was being pumped out in the 1890s. It's a bit of a shame, because to illustrate the progress which had been made in France, I'll give you this example. During the first 2 trials of Dreyfus, the fact that he was Jewish wasn't even mentioned. So that's something that's interesting. What really gave the Dreyfus Affair its venom was a magazine called Free Speech, which has been redacted in Paris. There was also La Croix, which was the French newspaper, which the French Catholic newspaper. These guys are really, you know, they were pumping out very, very anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish feeling, which wasn't necessarily present in France, certainly not in polite society at this time.
And of course, obviously, this leads us to the Vichy and Soane periods and the occupation. And of course, obviously, this is now bringing us fully up to the World War II period of time. If you could describe in detail that that transition from the Dreyfus Affair through the Vichy and Soane and through to the occupation.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Dreyfus's name was cleared in 1906. There was then a period of a sort of resurgence of nationalism in the 1920s and 30s. There was also at the same time, simultaneously, there was a big influx of Ashkenazi Jews coming from Eastern Europe. This has been happening since the late 19th century. So the anti-Jewish feeling, which didn't really exist in the 19th century, mutated and mixed with the sort of xenophobic fervor. So it was both anti-Jewish and anti-foreigner. They were really against the arrival of Jews from Russia, from Poland, and from Belarus. This was also mixed in with Darwinism and social Darwinism. The historian Yuval Noah Harari once he described National Socialism as untrammeled social Darwinism. So in the poisonous mix of xenophobia and an anti-Jewish propaganda, you also now had this notion of Jews being racially different. This is when anti-Jewish rage became anti-Semitic, and there was a great amount of resentment towards any Jewish public figures, such as Leon Blum, who was the leader of the Popular Front in France. He was actually ripped out of his car publicly in Paris.
Can you also explain? And can you explain the arrival of the Pieds-Noirs in Marseille and what Pieds-Noirs means?
Yeah, sure. I'll just finish addressing the situation with Vichy. I'll go over that because I think that's something which can't be left out. In 1940, France became occupied by the soldiers, the forces of the Third Reich, and the Vichy regime took over a certain amount of territory in the south of France. The Vichy regime was led by Marshal Pétain, who was a marshal from the First World War, who was very highly decorated, very highly respected, and right from the inception of Vichy, anti-Semitic laws were put into place. This is where legislation in France, for the first time in its history, became anti-Semitic. Racial laws were put in place in France, in Vichy France, in 1940. There were foreign Jews from neighbouring countries who'd fled to France, following the rise to power of the Nazis, and the Vichy government advocated right from 1940 the deportation and the incarceration of foreign Jews. They would subsequently pass laws to deport and incarcerate French Jews. I think the summum of this, the most tragic incident of the whole Shoah period in France, was the incident of the Veldiv in Paris. The Veldiv is shorthand, if you like, for the Vélodrome d'hiver. In June 1942, in the night of the 16th of June, in the early hours of the morning, the Jews of Paris were rounded up for immediate deportation to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now, they rounded up 9,000 men and 4,000 children, beginning at about 4 o'clock in the morning. They had soldiers bust in, volunteers, I might add, from the south of France, to aid the Gestapo and the German occupiers in Paris. In France, 76,000 Jews lost their lives, were murdered in the Shoah.
Wow. And to get back to the point, so the arrival of the Pieds-Noirs in Marseille,
Yes.
What is this chapter about, and how, and describe the word Pied-Noir, what that means, and when this actually happened?
Okay, Pied-Noir, that means literally black feet. It was a nickname given to the French who lived in Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco as well. The French colonized Algeria back in 1830. As I said, Jews were given legal status as French citizens in 1870. There was the outbreak of the Algerian War of Independence in 1954, and the Jews, along with the French, started to exit the country from 1954 onwards. Now, those who were repatriated to France didn't just come from Algeria or Tunisia or Morocco. The beginning of the great influx to Marseille, especially, was in 1956 during the war in Indochina. Then the French Algerians started to come back. They started pouring into France in 1958, and in 1962, at the end of the Algerian War, after the declaration of independence, there were around and about 1.5 million Pieds-Noirs. These were French-speaking people who'd lived in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, of French descent, of Maltese descent, of Spanish descent, but also a sizable amount of Sephardic Jews as well. Marseille's Jewish population, for example, grew from a few thousand to 100,000 in these years. So the Jewish community in Marseille is massively Algerian and Tunisian, with all of the traditions and customs that go with that.
Well, let's bring us up to date now. We've had the Ilian Halmi and the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and of course, obviously, Charlie Hebdo was a Jewish outlet in Paris, and this has given rise to some instability in France. Now, please describe what the current state of play is with the Jewish community and their reaction to what is actually happening in modern day France within their communities.
Yeah, sure. I was working a temporary contract as a teacher in an art school, a Jewish school in Marseille, back in 2015 and 2016. The Charlie Hebdo attacks took place in 2015, at the beginning of 2015, as did the attacks on the hyper carrières, the hyper kosher supermarket, in which 5 people lost their lives. It was a very strange period. I remember going to work and greeting sentries every day. There were sentries put in place who were actually sleeping in the school where I worked on camp beds, and they were given they were put on post with submachine guns to protect the children and the teachers who were being educated at the Orb at that point. I remember speaking to the head teacher of the school, and I said, well, at least the children are protected for now. And she said, yeah, what about when the soldiers leave? It was a very strange period indeed. The children were subjected to confinement exercises, whereby an alarm would be hit by the security officer of the school, the chief security officer, and then the children would be told to hide under their desks. The teacher would lock the door of each classroom, and a recording of machine gun fire would be played over the sound system to simulate a hostage situation. It was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. What also happened in 2015, which of course you all know about, was the Ninth Intifada. Do you remember that, David? The Ninth Intifada?
I believe that was a period of time in which I was actually having my 2 days downtime after my 4th trip in Israel, when a Palestinian went into a synagogue in West Jerusalem and stabbed and killed 4 rabbis on the Shabbat service at around about 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning.
That's right, yeah. So the Ninth Intifada in Jerusalem and in Israel inspired knock-on attacks in France. So from 2015 onwards, there was a massive boom, if you like, a massive increase in Olim. People started to make aliyah to Israel. The demographic change in Tel Aviv, as you know, over the past 5 years has been dramatic, to say the least. There's a massive French-speaking Jewish community now in Tel Aviv, both from Belgium and from France. So it's these Islamic fundamentalist attacks have had a big impact on Jewish life in France. Some people stayed over there. I know people who came back because life in Israel isn't for everybody. But that's the situation as it is at the moment. Going back 10 years before the Charlie Hebdo attacks, there was the attack on Ilan Halimi. That was back in 2006. Ilan was a young man who was enticed by a honey trap. He was enticed by honey trap messages, and he was subsequently tortured by a gang of Muslim extremists for 23 days. He was beaten, raped with a broomstick, and tortured in the basement of a council estate, of what they call a cité in France. I think it's one of the most horrific things that's happened in modern French history. And it wasn't really publicised in the international press. Ilan was found on railway sidings where he'd been burnt to death by his attackers. So just there were some horrific things that have happened in France over in recent times. The cemeteries have been desecrated. Saverne Cemetery was desecrated. Synagogues have been burned. I had a colleague who was attacked as a direct result of the Ninth Intifada, and the young boys who were educated at the Ort where I worked carried pepper spray with them wherever they went. The chief rabbi, the head rabbi of Marseille, issued an order to all male Jews in Marseille in 2015 and 2016. He issued 2 orders, in fact, for all male Jews to wear a baseball cap over their yarmulkes, over their kippahs. So this is what's been happening in France, and I see it as really quite unjust that this has had so little media exposure.
Well, thank you very much for this great presentation. On a final note, just give the audience a general feel of what it's like to be a Jewish person living in a Jewish community in, say, for instance, your home city, Marseille.
Yeah, well, I'd like to end things on a happy note, and I think it's entirely possible to do so. As I said, my wife is of Sephardic descent. Being a Jew in France is as rich and wonderful as being a Jew elsewhere, and I might say even more so, because there are so many wonderful cultural influences on Jewish life here. My wife's aunt is an expert at making Tunisian couscous. She starts her Shabbat cooking spree. Sometimes it starts on as early as a Wednesday, to give you an idea of how long she prepares for the Shabbat. So yeah, you can eat well here, that's for sure. What else is there? Well, there is a presence of a lot of different types of a lot of different Jewish communities here in Marseille. There are Ashkenazim, there are Sephardim. We have a sizable Lubavitch congregation here in Marseille. There are liberal congregations. It's a flourishing and wonderful life here for Jews, and there's a lot of exchange between Marseille and Israel. And as far as French popular culture is concerned, there are a massive amount of Jewish performers in the music industry and in public life in general. So I think that it's good to stay strong, to be proud of being Jewish, of being a French Jew, and not to be pulled down by hooligans.
Thank you very much, Michael, and it's been a pleasure doing this show. And I hope our audience really enjoy this show and find it informative and a blessing. And it's good to have a gauge with regards to the history of a particular people in a particular nation, of which, broadly speaking, there's a lot written about, but not much publicized about. Thank you very much, Michael, and may you enjoy the rest of the day. And thank you to the audience for joining. Till next time, goodbye.
Thanks, David. Bye.